Thank you so much for joining us for the Madison House Big Give Live. I'm Tess Lenahan. I'm a second-year student in the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. And myself and three of my practical nonprofit fundraising classmates, Josh Island, Reese Poe, and Liv William, have been working closely with Madison House over the semester and have organized this discussion in honor of Madison House's brand new Day of Giving, the Big Give. Today, I'm joined by Tim Frylick, the Executive Director of Madison House, Jamie Jarrow, Assistant Professor in the School of Education and Human Development, as well as Dr. Rose Cole, who is the Director of Community Engagement of Madison House. And Tim and Rose will share ways Madison House has prioritized an equity-based approach in their pandemic response, especially around youth and education. And Dr. Jarrow will be providing us with more context for understanding the educational opportunity gap. Thank you all for sending in your questions, and I can encourage you to continue doing so in the Q&A function. It should be just at the bottom of your screen next to the raise hand feature, and we will continue answering them as they come in. Tim, Rose, and Jamie, thank you so much for joining us today. Tim, would you like to start by introducing yourself a bit more?
Sure. Thank you, Tess, and good afternoon, everyone. As Tess said, my name is Tim Frylick, and I'm the Executive Director of Madison House. For more than 50 years, as a lot of us know, Madison House has served as the independent volunteer center for students at the University of Virginia. Our dual mission is to build partnerships to address community needs while also supporting the leadership development of our students. And so my job as director is to help direct the positive energy of student leaders and volunteers at the university I love into the community I love and where I'm raising my daughters. When I was a student back in the late 1900s, I worked on the pediatric unit at the UVA hospital as a Madison House volunteer. Now, some students find their path to rewarding careers in medicine through volunteering at Madison House. I was not one of those students. While I loved working with the kids on the unit, I realized that I didn't want to work in a hospital setting. But just last week, I took my girls to see their pediatrician here in Charlottesville. He used to be the student head program director of Madison House's medical services program back in the day. So every student finds their own path and way through Madison House. In a typical year, about 3,000 Madison House students volunteer more than 100,000 hours of their time, working with more than 100 of our partners in the community. This, of course, has not been a typical year. Nevertheless, Madison House has continued to thrive thanks to the work of our dedicated student leaders, volunteers, staff, and board. Before we continue with the program today, though, I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Jamie Jarrow and Dr. Rose Cole. I also want to thank Professor Erin Hall and her team of students in the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. They're taking a course for a good cause, practical nonprofit fundraising. Madison House loves partnering with faculty and students, and we're really grateful for their work conceiving and executing this panel presentation today. We're also indebted to Batten School event coordinator Millie Hicks for her technical support, so thank you all. Finally, I want to thank all of you, our supporters, alumni, friends, and partners of Madison House. We just couldn't do our work without you. Donations pay for our students' transportation to their shifts, for personnel costs, pizza, background checks, and everything needed to support our students' work. Today is Madison House's first ever Big Give philanthropy event. And we're excited to be able to match the first $30,000 of contributions to Madison House given today. Last time I checked, we were already halfway to our goal, just past halfway. If you're a regular supporter, or even if you've never given before, today's a great day to show your support. In these times of great uncertainty, Madison House is looking forward with hope and optimism to the day when our volunteer corps is back in the community in person at full force, and your support will make that possible. When university leadership announced last March that they basically didn't want students returning to grounds after spring break in a bid to stem the spread of the coronavirus, Madison House had a tough choice to make. On the one hand, we of course had the instinct as a volunteer center to want to provide even more volunteers to support our community partners in their time of greatest need. But at the same time, we realized that the best thing Madison House could do for the local community was actually to dramatically limit our well-traveled students' interactions with local residents. Our student leaders are tremendously responsible, and they were the ones who told us, look, the communal living and dining situation that we find ourselves in, is problematic from a coronavirus spread point of view. So to protect the community and to support the university's message, we shut down in-person volunteering at Madison House and pivoted to virtual volunteering wherever feasible. And Dr. Cole will talk much more about that. While this decision has been frustrating at times for all of us, for our students as well as our community partners, there is no question in my mind that we made the right call. As COVID case rates at the university have spiked above the local community prevalence rate on a couple different occasions, it's been clear that Charlottesville residents would have suffered had our couple thousand students been interacting closely with them. We, of course, look forward to volunteering again in person as soon as it's safe to do so. And finally, as more of our students are eligible and getting vaccinated, that day is quickly approaching. So, but this pause in-person volunteering hasn't been all bad. It's actually given us at Madison House a chance to take a closer look at our programs and how we operate. Madison House Director of Community Engagement, Dr. Rose Cole, has been instrumental in helping Madison House evolve so we can emerge even stronger in the months ahead. And it's my pleasure to let you hear from her directly about what our students have been doing here at Madison House. They continue to do some incredible work. Rose, go ahead.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. Hi, everyone, and thanks to all the folks that Tim so graciously thanked, and to everyone attending. I'm excited to talk more about the work from this year. So just to give a little bit of intro and context, I've been at Madison House since fall of 2019, which means I haven't had a non-pandemic year at Madison House yet, but I've been doing kind of work and research and assessment in the kind of community engagement space at UVA since 2014, 2015, when I was a full-time doctoral student in the School of Education studying higher ed policy. And I, have my initial research interest was focused on the sort of K to 16 pipeline and college access for first generation and underserved students. And so I, have some research and publications focused on that, but my research focus changed to in 2014 and 2015 when I started working in the Charlottesville context. And the bulk of my work is now on the kind of transformative potential of community engaged spaces on college campuses and community-based learning for college students. That this kind of learning is a sort of force for equity and justice in our society and in the world, actually. So I'm really excited to be in this space of Madison House, even in a pandemic, sort of like the ultimate theory to practice of trying to translate some of what we know works for the community into what we know our student leaders and student volunteers are capable of and motivated to do. So to give a little bit of context, pre-pandemic, in fall of 2019, when I started, Madison House had 13 programs with youth and education community partners. And so in a normal year, that meant that between 800 or 1,000 volunteers actually went out and worked with youth in the community, either through schools-based programs or through community-based partners, community-based organizations that served as our partners. And so one of the first things, even pre-pandemic, was one of the first things I was sort of tasked with is kind of getting a handle on this and trying to understand how we could, that is a huge amount of hours, just pure hours in a community when you're talking about 1,000 students over an academic year. And how can we, how could we really leverage that for our community? Because it meant that the tradition of Madison House was what allowed it to flourish, but also sort of kept it a little bit spread out and less accessible to coordination from our community partners and schools. So in the fall of 2019, we were already in really detailed discussions with our stakeholders around education and youth about, what the next 50 years of Madison House should look like when it comes to this space. And some key themes emerged, but one of them was sort of how can Madison House help education and youth stakeholders go beyond the status quo? I think that's sort of one of the things we think about a lot as a volunteer center, which is that volunteers can just get plugged in to business as usual. And what was really clear from our partners is that they wanted to harness the energy and the work of our student volunteers to help them meet goals that were related to sort of transforming equity issues and school goals and that kind of thing. So that sort of idea of how do we become a tool for our community partners to change things rather than maintain things, something that was already sort of baked into thinking about education and youth. And then the pandemic hit. So, our pandemic response began very slowly and carefully. In March and April 2020, I feel like we had so many meetings with so many stakeholders about, as part of the UVA community, about what can the UVA community do to support the folks on the ground trying to make sure that kids were okay, and when school closed and when everything became distance learning. And a lot of the feedback was about keeping the community safe, like relating to what Tim said. And a lot of it too was sort of trying to stem the tide of do-gooderism, of kind of like, can we be, so Madison has ended up serving as a resource for our community partners to make sure that we could kind of control the students that wanted to help and sort of channel their energy in a direction. And we ended up putting a lot of effort into background checking, training, the kind of the security concerns around distance learning, and sort of just acted as if when the school said they wanted us, when the school said they needed support, when our community partners said they were ready for us, how could we be geared up and just kind of like ready to mobilize? And so, when that happened, it wasn't until November of 2020. So we put, our student leaders put so much work in. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight was a partnership with the Virginia Equity Center, where what we were able to do was say, if we just open up tutoring to just anyone who wants a tutor, we know from the research that hurts students who are most in need, because it just increases the opportunity gap for our local students. And so we sort of shut things down. And then when the school system, when Albemarle County came to us with a need to help their most vulnerable students, English language learners, in one of the high schools, we were able to sort of mobilize with the work that we did. So this piloted program in the fall has now expanded to almost 400 UVA students Zooming into classes where English language learners are taking algebra, writing classes, a lot of STEM support. And our students who have the language skills are translating and helping and staying on afterwards to help complete homework. And our students who don't have language skills or who don't have multiple languages and can't translate for teachers are also there to just help everyone in the class. And so this is one of those things that we, sort of exemplifies for us what we were trying to do, which is to make sure that when we mobilize our students, they are in the service of broader equity goals and not sort of unthinkingly maintaining the status quo, because we know in a pandemic, the status quo for education is actually going to be a real problem for us. So, I just wanted to kind of share that timeline and end with the, success of this program. I'm happy to talk more. I want to be cognizant of time, and if people have questions. And we also have other tutoring and education programs up and running in the same vein, but that was really the one that illustrated the best, I think, for an audience like this. So I hope that that is, something that Dr. Jarrow can even shed a little more insight into and kind of give the educational context to help understand why pulling back and, keeping our 1,000 students from just having a big, broad, wide open, anyone can request a tutor, why that kind of counterintuitive approach has ended up, I think, serving us and our community better. So I will hand it over to her.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie Jarrow, and I'm a faculty member over at the School of Education and Human Development. And before I jump in and talk about the achievement gap and the pandemic effect on schooling, I also just want to give my kind of perspective as an instructor who teaches students at the University of Virginia, just because I see how much of a benefit participating in the Madison House activities has been for students, not just in what they're giving back to the community, but what they're getting from that in terms of being able to take what they're learning in their classes. So, for example, I teach cognitive psychology and education, and I teach a child development class, and we teach a lot of classes at the School of Education around issues of equity and issues related to education. And seeing our students be able to see these in real life, to see that these are real children that we're talking about, and to be able to interact with children and see the effects of really slight differences in those interactions and how much of an impact they can have on children, and kind of putting them on a different trajectory, I think just makes that learning so much more impactful and meaningful. And then beyond that, I think, the work with Madison House gets them excited and recognizing opportunities where they can have real impact after graduating. And again, kind of changing the trajectory of the students themselves in terms of what their future goals might be and the potential they have to make lasting changes through those experiences that you don't get from a classroom. And just more generally, anything you learn and then practice in the real world is going to stick so much better. We know that from research on how we learn and the science of learning. And so I think that this program is just so beneficial for students in so many ways, in addition to being so beneficial for the community and providing that really important bridge to make sure that the university and the community are kind of partners in supporting each other. But switching over to my hat as a researcher and understanding kind of how children develop and how children are learning and what influences their learning, just in general, I'm sure that everybody has heard about what's often called the achievement gap. And this is just the general pattern of differences observed across different groups that have differences in opportunity experiences. So I like to think of it as more of an opportunity gap than an achievement gap. And just the differences in children's preparation when they get to school in the first place. So what kinds of experiences they've had in preschool and the different preparation levels. And we have so many programs that are intended to kind of have children all starting out at the same level, but we don't see that happens. So even at the entrance of kindergarten, their first formal schooling experience for many children, you see differences in where children are on their literacy skills, their math skills, their social emotional skills. And you see these differences between racial groups, so Black, white student differences. You see income inequality differences, so higher, middle, and lower income students, where lower income students are starting out at a disadvantage where they're not as prepared for that school experience. And then especially children who have that English language challenge on top of kind of what all the other things that they're learning, and teachers who maybe don't have the resources to help support those students. So you see a lot of inequality from the very beginning, and that inequality fortunately doesn't tend to grow so much across the board. It stays pretty constant, but it doesn't narrow, and that's an issue. And now, of course, we have this issue of the pandemic, and thinking about how children are being impacted by that, we see, just like with all opportunity gap issues, that there are big differences in the types of resources available to children. And that includes kind of resources of people who have the time and the knowledge and the skills to be able to help support children when they're doing online learning, as well as the resources that are necessary for children to be healthy and ready to learn. So for example, nutritional access. So being able to have healthy food. And we know that the government is paying for healthy food, but you still have to show up there with your child to get that food. And the communication to know when to show up can be really challenging. In Charlottesville city schools, we have more than 50 languages spoken by our students. And so thinking about how to disseminate information across so many different languages becomes such a big challenge. And so you see differences in who's able to take advantage of those resources. And you see differences in which children are able to have the support when they click the link and it doesn't work. And I promise you that happens so often. Everything can be set up perfectly, but the link doesn't work for anybody, even the teachers. And so what do parents do if they aren't tech savvy? I have trouble, and I'm on a computer teaching through these same programs all day, and it's really, really challenging. And so when you have parents who maybe don't speak English, when you have parents who are trying to work at the same time, or when you have parents who have to work outside of the home because otherwise they can't afford to pay their rent, or they can't afford to buy the food for their children to eat, and they have to rely on whatever they can in terms of people to supervise their children, there's just not the same kind of experience by children in those different situations. And we've heard about English language learners and what a special challenge that has been in needing support. If you think about how challenging it is to learn a new language, probably everybody has had that experience. Now imagine doing that through a computer screen with a teacher that's often teaching students who are completely fluent in English at the same time. It's so much harder to follow the language, but then also you're not getting those interactions. You're not getting the visual aids that provide so much of that support and scaffolding. And we know one of the most important things for children's learning are social interactions and those relationships with teachers. And now you have children trying to form relationships online, and it's so much harder to begin with. But then when there's a language barrier on top of that, that's even more challenging. And then you have challenges related to the resources of internet and computers that work. So if you don't have the internet bandwidth to have your video on, how are those relationships going to form? And how are teachers going to know when students are struggling or need help or fell behind or missed something if they can't even see them? And so you see all of these impacts of, these things that we already know cause issues with children being able to kind of have the same opportunities as their peers related to income, related to parent education, related to language issues, and these exacerbate the effects that we see. Across the board, projections are estimating anywhere from 37 to 68% of learning gains compared to what we would typically see in children based on how much access they're having to the online learning experiences. And we know that this is not universal. So we know that, if we can estimate 60% learning compared to a typical year, that's going to be different across different groups. So some of the highest income groups are actually projected to show no loss and maybe even gains from what's typical. And then children who are in poverty are actually going to show, they're estimating 3 times higher percentages of not having those interactions with teachers, not making contact. And so when we do the projections of learning, you see much lower estimates of learning. And not only, are we seeing the impact on learning itself, but the things that the families are going through. So looking at job loss, looking at COVID health issues, especially death. I saw a statistic that Black Americans make up only 13% of the US population, but 33% of COVID-19 hospitalizations and 34% of COVID-19 deaths. And I know even here in Charlottesville, we've had elementary school age children who have lost parents and are trying to learn and are showing up in the classroom and having to function. So anything that can be done to provide more one-on-one support for children, and anything that can be done to relieve some of the demands and pressure on teachers is such a huge benefit. And so thinking about the potential for Madison House volunteers to be able to get out and provide some of that support, I think again can make a really big impact and can help to kind of address some of these inequalities and try to address that gap in the opportunities that children have for learning. But I want to also leave plenty of time for discussion and question and hear more about what Madison House has in store. So
thank you so much, Jamie, Tim, and Rose. And now we can start answering some of the questions that have been sent in, but please do continue using the Q&A. We'd love to answer your guys' questions. But you kind of touched on this a bit, but what do you think, Jamie, are some of the ways in which our education system can shift to better supporting all youth? Are there ways that we can lessen the achievement gap?
We've been trying to figure that out for many, many years. And we are identifying some of the things that might matter. And so we know that teacher preparation is so important. So teachers knowing kind of the best ways of teaching children and learning how to kind of meet children where they are and differentiate instruction is really important. And again, the relationships that teachers have with students helps them to be able to recognize when a child might need some support. You can't learn if you're too distracted because something's going on at home, or you can't learn if you're starving because you didn't get a chance to have breakfast, or if you didn't get enough sleep because, of whatever reason, maybe you had to help take care of a sick parent or a sibling or something. And so just having those relationships be built so that teachers know how to best support their children and having access to people who can help to match families with resources. So people in the school who have that position to kind of take that off the teachers because teachers are so overburdened already. Social work is so important to help identify resources. And then local, connecting with local resources like Madison House and like the IRC to help to identify who needs that support. And yeah, I think we're still trying to figure out what the best way to address the achievement gap is. I think another thing is universal preschool and helping to really focus on getting children to at least start out at a more kind of equal level, but then figuring out why we tend to also see fade out effects over time. And I think it is because instead of, figuring out how to fit schools to our children, we're trying to change children to fit schools that were designed for a specific piece of the population instead of all of the children that we're trying to serve. So I think kind of taking a step back and figuring out what it looks like to make schools fit the children and their needs rather than trying to fit children into kind of predetermined ways of learning.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's obviously a very hard thing to address, but work that you guys are all doing is incredible. And we have another question, and it's what pandemic-related changes do you think will last or maybe positive in our education system? And which ones do you think have been the most harmful or should be reversed going forward?
I think some children have actually benefited from online learning, and we've seen that for children who have different issues with anxiety. When we see that children are spending so much time trying to just get to school and travel back home, and they actually are able to learn online. It's a way of providing the opportunity to be in school and be on time and reduce that barrier. So kind of broadening access to education, I think, is a big benefit of realizing what we can do with online learning. I think online learning, some people have figured out ways to do it really well where, large groups of children are able to be successful. And so learning from those experiences to create more opportunities for those that need to learn online if they don't have access to education. And I think also, sometimes children can't go to school for different reasons. And so knowing that is an option to provide that online programming, I think helps to reduce, it's better than not having school. But I do think that it's really hard to develop skills like social emotional skills and the social interactions and relationships that children get from being in person in schools. It's going to be really hard to get online. And so I think that's one of the things that has really been difficult for children is, just having all of their interactions be through the screen. And so that's one of the things that going back to school is going to help them to feel kind of more like they're part of a community and have that sense of relatedness and belonging that they get from being part of the community. But I do think, for a small portion of children, this might be something that actually addresses some of the challenges they were having in the in-person setting. And I do think it's a way of thinking about creating strong resources for children who, for whatever reason, want to be learning from outside of school and, potentially enrichment programs. So we know, like AP courses are not offered at similar levels across all schools. And maybe that's something that children could do. We could we could create better online options for courses that might not be available for some students in some schools, and use that as a way of getting some good out of this. And I also think some kids have developed a lot of skills that we don't measure on the achievement tests that we're comparing them to, from last year to this year. So I would imagine that if we were looking at self-regulation skills, that some children have really developed those and have become more independent, and being able to do what they need to do while they're at home and their parents are working. So I think that's all been beneficial. But I also think one of the biggest harms has been on the demands on teachers. And I'm hoping that we don't lose teachers, because that's already a challenge, and that we find a way to make sure that our teachers are recovering and given the chance to recover and be supported, moving forward. And ideally, when we go back in person, that we find ways of even supporting them at higher levels than before, and recognizing how much they matter and how much we rely on them for taking care of our children and providing such an important source of kind of comfort and support beyond just teaching them.
Yeah, and kind of going off of that, is there research that suggests the efficacy of online learning versus classroom learning?
So it's tricky. Research is so slow that we don't know, so much about kind of online versus in person during a pandemic when there's all of the other stress going on. There and it's also there's so much variation, just like in schools. You see so much variation in the quality of education and how much you see children learning. And with online, there are programs that have been very effective, especially, we have much more research at the college level, and children and college students doing online learning. And when people are trained to do online learning and when courses are designed to be taught online, they can be just as effective or even more effective depending on what it is that is being taught as in-person education. But that's not what happened during the pandemic. So some programs were already online. Some children already did online, charter school, and even the Virginia State has an online program and option, and that was designed to be online, and that is able to be just as effective for supporting learning in children as in-person education. But that's for children who were choosing that for a specific reason and had the support. You can't take a program that was designed for a small number of children and had a teacher facilitating that and just dump thousands and thousands of more children and expect it to work, the same way. So the research suggests that it depends whether or not it's effective, and the type of kind of online instruction without being planned for that is not as effective. And then it gets at what other resources did the children have to support their learning in terms of how much learning happened, and how much the gaps have increased, or where we see differential effects of online learning.
Thank you. And as you've kind of talked about, there have been varying levels of achievement and success for different children. And I was wondering, how can schools and other institutions help address learning loss as a result of the pandemic?
I think just not focusing so much on learning loss and just trying to figure out where are our students, and starting from there and thinking what did they not get, not just achievement wise, but what did they not get in terms of the social and emotional support and learning that they would normally have, and starting there. And it's been hard having kids on screens for so much of the time, and now they're back in person. I imagine that there's going to need to be really intentional adjustment to kind of relearning what it's like to be in the school context, and it's going to continue changing, right? So right now what they're doing is small classes and they can't get close to each other, and they're doing pods and they're wearing masks, and they can't use cafeterias. Like, everything is different still, even if they're back in person, and it's going to continue to change. We have no idea what it will look like this fall, what it will look like a year from now. And so I think get away from trying to think where would these kids have been had the pandemic not happened, and focus on where are our children now and what do they need most to be, to address their well-being in general, and then focus on kind of, okay, here's where they are, let's continue from there, and not think about learning loss or trying to catch up or anything like that.
Well, thank you so much, Jamie. This was incredibly informative. We appreciate it so much. And now we will move on to some questions that are related to Madison House specifically. And we'll be asking Tim and Rose to provide their insight on some of these questions that we're getting in. So the first is, how do Madison House programs aim to address educational inequities during the pandemic and during normal years as well?
Yeah, I can take that. And Tim, if I miss anything, you can always jump in. But I really appreciated Dr. Jarrow's overview of the kind of big picture, because I think it shows how big the picture is when it comes to educational inequity, that it's sort of a system-wide failure. It's not just one thing that you can, fix with one approach and strategy. And so I think that as an organization, it's actually a learning opportunity for our student leaders and student volunteers to think about the systems that we're a part of and how to understand them in a way so that you can make the most of the role that you have access to as a student volunteering leader. And I actually think one of the things that has the potential to be most damaging to educational institutions is an idea that a bunch of undergraduate students could fix them. Like we have entire there's entire schools of ed that are still having trouble fix them. And I think that sort of channeling inspiration and good intentions into a kind of understanding of the big picture is a big part of this. Not to sound like a bummer, I always feel like kind of the bummer sometimes when I'm talking about this, of putting things into scope. But so, for example, when I think about one of the ways that we can, one of the ways that Madison House thinks about educational inequities, one of the things that we actually do have access to in terms of a lever is making things easier or harder for teachers, and sort of either easing the burden or adding to the burden. And I think constantly asking our student leaders and programs to be aware of that dynamic and to recognize that hosting volunteers in a classroom is a service that teachers are also providing us. And so that we need to make sure that we think about that and not just assume that, that it's super, I feel like there's something sort of counterintuitive about it, right? That you kind of have to recognize the give and take. So that lever of trying to ease the burden on teachers, it can be a lot of different ways. In the pandemic, some of the approaches have been, thinking specifically about language support, and that being something that we have heard from teachers, paying for interpreters and translators for tens of languages, 50 or 60 languages in one school is not feasible. And so teachers being able to rely on a student who can speak Thai or Spanish and be there to help, that truly does sort of ease some of the burden for them. And it also connects to a student. This is anecdotal. We haven't studied this because it's actually happening, as we don't have data on this yet. But there is a sort of anecdotal pattern of students being more, high school students being more likely to attend when they have a connection to someone who's speaking their language, which I think is pretty, makes a lot of sense. That when they were coming in and they're learning English and trying to learn algebra in the language that they're still learning, that's really hard. But coming in and having someone who speaks their language talk through algebra with them and help translate their questions to the teacher makes it more likely that they keep showing up. I think that is a real key way. We sort of structured it so that those could be outcomes, and so that even if that doesn't happen, we're not making the teacher's life harder. Another thing I think a lot about is our approach to placements for some sort of field work type placements for people who are in the intro to becoming a teacher class, or sort of this sort of widespread things that might have relied on being a teacher's assistant. And one of the things that we, partnered with the School of Ed to do and with teachers is, instead of asking a bunch of teachers to figure out how to do placements for us, we were able to really take to heart the feedback that maxed out capacity of teachers meant that there wasn't really ways for them to figure out, especially in the spring, how to coordinate volunteers in their classrooms in the way that they might for a normal year. And so we actually, coordinated a series of conversations that were videoed with teachers so that students who would have been placed could have a conversation or view recordings with teachers to learn about the reality of education in the pandemic, and not have to burden teachers to figure out how to do that on a kind of one-to-one classroom placement basis. And so I think that our student leaders being really creative around, okay, so here's the goal. They want placements for this. How could we, get to that in a way in the pandemic that is preserving the sanity of teachers? It isn't a one-to-one ratio of achievement gap, but I think it's really strengthening the foundation that needs to be strong in order for teachers and schools to be able to address that. And the last thing that I'll use as an example is we coordinated and partnered with the schools, some of whom had safety concerns over trying to connect students into classrooms on Zoom. And I don't know if you all remember in spring 2020, all the articles about Zoom bombing and, just sort of it was sort of scary. And one of the ways that we sort of thought about that was we partnered with the Equity Center and offered family-based tutors that were sort of based on referrals from teachers in schools and community organizations, so that a family could reach out and ask for someone to help their kiddos. And we were able to kind of do that in a way on the Fridays when people weren't Zooming into classes. And so that kind of really targeted family-based tutoring as one way of channeling things. That also turned into music practice partners, where middle school students who had just started playing instruments and then didn't have the practice at school, and maybe parents didn't have the resources to get individual lessons for their students, they could request a UVA student to do Zoom kind of practice sessions with their instruments. And so, all of these things that just sort of add a bit of capacity to the system to increase the likelihood that things could be more equitable, I think is one of the ways that Madison House can really help. And when you think about the scale that we're at, where there's hundreds and thousands of students who want to help, when we have the resources to sort of cement some of this work in place and build on it, I think post-pandemic, the potential for that is even more exciting and more important. So, okay, I will.
And I have just absolutely loved that our student leaders are getting the chance to learn from such a dedicated professional like Rose, and to help them understand that if we just, for example, make tutoring available to anyone, that those families who are most in need of additional assistance will likely not be able to access that support. And so it's just tremendous that our students have been part of that learning process and are grappling with those issues. Rose mentioned that we've been looking with an equity lens at all of the work that we do. And certainly in this tutoring and classroom assistant program, that's one of the areas where I'm just delighted, and I'm sure that we're going to continue with many of the lessons that we've learned this year, even as we transition back to more in-person work.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. And clearly, Madison House has made a lot of really amazing and innovative changes to your programs in order to better serve the community during the pandemic. And I was just wondering what changes will remain when things go back to normal.
So one of the exciting things I think for all of us, while I think everybody has quite a bit of Zoom fatigue at this point. When we have student volunteers who are interested in working with our community partners, they'll typically sign up for a shift. And if it's working with a family that's, say, over the mountain in Waynesboro, that's a 40-minute drive. And the students basically have to commit a 3.5-hour block if they're going to have an hour with the student, and so, or 2.5 hours. So there will be some situations where we continue the virtual exchanges to maximize the time that our volunteers are able to spend working with community partners in the community. And so we're looking at all of our programs that way. I don't know, Rose, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I also think the school calendar, the academic calendar, not necessarily aligning perfectly with the K-12 calendar in our community, that we are really excited about the potential of students kind of committing to helping kids through, helping children all the way through a school year, even if they move back home and aren't on grounds anymore for that last month. That has always been a challenge, and that's a challenge sort of writ large across higher ed when you think about sort of engaging with schools and youth. So I think that will be a really important thing that we continue. And I also think this sort of centralization of training and sort of thinking about baseline trainings for working with youth in a weird way. I mean, the pandemic gave us access to do that really quickly and just say, if you want to be placed in the kind of remote tutoring setup, you have to have this kind of base level instead of having all 13 programs sort of have different training. And so I think that we're really trying to make sure we keep that kind of energy of like, let's think about all of our education and youth programs as different facets of the same sort of tool for our community. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you guys so much. Our next question is, how has Madison House continued to identify, recruit, and train student leaders without in-person events?
It's definitely one of the challenges that we've faced. I mean, particularly for folks who have been involved in Madison House in the past, everyone knows that the student leader core itself is one of the major sort of driving sources of energy. I mean, Madison House obviously would not exist without the student leaders and the volunteers. And we've been a central part of the undergraduate experience at UVA dating back 52 years now. And what drives that are the bonds that are formed between our student leaders and our team, the professional team at Madison House. And so it's definitely been a challenge. At the same time, what we've seen is that our head program directors, we have about 25 head program directors, they have risen to the challenge in every way across all of our programs. I've been thrilled, for example, to watch our tax preparation program. We have the CASH program, it's called. We love our acronyms at Madison House. That one's Creating Assets, Savings, and Hope, right? Well, each year they, help local residents file in a typical year more than 2,000 federal and state tax returns, returning nearly 3 million to the community. That program, usually meets in person, face to face, with the folks who are filing their taxes. And this year, in partnership with the United Way, who's been working with us, Madison House has been doing taxes for folks locally or helping folks prepare their taxes dating back to the earliest years of the program in 1972, I think. But in the last dozen years, we've partnered with the local United Way, and they've done an amazing job this year helping us pivot to a model where they receive and scan all the documents up, and then our students are able to work virtually with the individual through phone calls and on the tax prep platform to get the work done. And you know, while the numbers will not meet our 2,000 plus that we like to do this year, they have done an extraordinary job, and several hundred returns are being filed, and more than 1 million returned to the community. And so that's just one example of one of our programs that has made an incredible pivot to the virtual environment.
Awesome, thank you. And another question is, which Madison House programs and community needs will be prioritized coming out of the pandemic?
You know, this is a tricky question because we would, you know, I'll sort of speak for Tim here, in that I think that we try to only have programs that are based in community needs. You know, there are not a ton
Certainly.
of extraneous
Yep.
programs. And so really we're prioritizing, you know, I will say that from right now, we're in the process of prioritizing understanding our community partners without kind of like a sort of a gentle needs assessment process that doesn't put a huge burden on them, so that we can use the outcome from that to help guide the work in the fall and spring. And so that the feedback from community partners might end up helping shape that a little bit. I will say that education and youth have been a huge priority and will continue to be the pivot to kind of thinking about equity. I don't think that that will be at the expense of other programs coming back kind of online, because what has happened with other programs who need to kind of come back into whatever the post-pandemic reality will be is that they were sort of either paused or kind of very specific and, you know, like kind of almost like self-contained of figuring that out. And I think that that will not, you know, end up affecting what they need to prioritize for their community partners.
You know, I'll say also, as Rose mentioned, you know, we do try to have all of our programs serving community needs identified by our community partners. I think certainly during the pandemic, we have been, you know, acutely aware, as everyone is, of the desperate need for programs with food access and justice at the foreground. I'm really excited about one of our virtual pivots during the pandemic was in our housing improvement program. We weren't having students go out and work in the community for reasons I talked about earlier, but we were able to partner with a new initiative over at the Virginia Poverty Law Center, where students in our housing improvement program this past year have been helping staff an eviction hotline, providing basic information to individuals facing eviction. And so that's one example of the kind of ways. Similarly, our med services program has been working with the Blue Ridge Health District to make phone calls, first to inform employers of the latest restrictions on activities, on business activities, and more recently, letting folks know when it's their turn for a vaccination. And now that more of our students are being vaccinated, we will be offering support at the UVA Health's vaccination clinic. And so we're looking, you know, those are obviously areas directly pandemic related that we'll continue to focus on in the coming year as we work our way out of this situation. So.
Well, thank you guys so much for answering all those questions. If anyone has any last minute ones, please feel free to send them in the Q&A. But I personally have so enjoyed my work as an Albemarle High School tutor for the last 2 years, and I've seen what a wonderful job Madison House has done in making a smooth transition to virtual tutoring. It's just been a really great experience, and I've really enjoyed it. But we are nearing the end of our discussion, and I wanted to thank our panelists, Tim, Rose, and Jamie, again for joining us and giving us such important insight into the amazing work that Madison House has been doing to help our community combat these challenging times. And I'd also like to give a special thank you to our amazing practical nonprofit fundraising professor, Erin Hall, Sophia Schollander, Millie Hicks, Alice Sink, and everyone else at Madison House for helping facilitate this event. And thank you so much to everyone else who has joined us. It's amazing to see all the support for Madison House.
It has been a wonderful session. Thank you, students and Erin and Dr. Jarrow and everyone for your support of this event. I'm excited to report that even during this hour-long panel, we have jumped. We've now raised $35,600 today. I put the link in the chat if anyone wants to see or offer support. Again, because Madison House is independent, we really do rely on our donors, friends, volunteers, alums for support and to make our programs happen. And so thank you everyone for joining us today, and hope everyone has an excellent rest of the week.